So who was Tut? He comes after his disastrous, father Akhenaten, and decides immediately to reject the Aten worship and go back to the traditional gods. Hence his name change to Tutankhamen. However, we usually just call him Tut. And actually, in history, he's not a very important pharaoh. The reason why we talk about Tut, of course, is because of Tut's tomb. It is one of the only Egyptian tombs that has been found that had not been desecrated or looted in any way. And it was found by Howard Carter, a Brit, right, a British man, who became a Sir because of his find, right? So he became Sir Howard Carter. Howard Carter finds this site in 1922. But Tut himself, during his reign, we actually call him the Boy King. He was very young. We estimate he was maybe like 12-ish when he took power as pharaoh, and around 18-ish probably when he died. And he seems to have died very suddenly. Examination of his mummy seems to suggest that he suffered a broken leg that then went septic. That he got blood poisoning because of the fracture that never healed properly. So that's the sort of theory, right? People have about why he died so suddenly. And because he was such a minor pharaoh, they actually had not done much work on his tomb. And so they actually had to steal another guy's tomb, like a minor official. They had to take that person's tomb and co-opt it in a sense, right? Take it over. So we know by looking at the carvings that the heads of the individuals who represented Tut were recarved. The hieroglyphs were recarved to say Tut's name. So we know by studying the carvings in here that this was originally somebody else's tomb. And because of that, it's actually a very small tomb for a pharaoh. So if you're looking at the diagram and you're thinking, wow, it looks packed with all this stuff, kind of like a crazy garage sale. There's a reason why it looks that way because, again, someone of his status would have warranted typically a much larger tomb, but he ended up with this small tomb because of that. We think it's also the reason it was never looted because the evidence shows us that what had happened is that Tut's tomb was completed and then probably forgotten about, and then there was a rock slide in the area that covered over the tomb, and then later on they came and actually built another tomb on top of it. So that tomb was looted, but not Tut's. The famous story of Howard Carter is that he was digging in the Valley of the Kings, and they had dug the tomb on top, and of course it had been looted, so not much was there. And he told his crew, basically, I want to keep digging here. I just have this feeling something's here. And they were thinking he's crazy, of course. And then he finds the stairway. If you look at number one, he finds that, and then they go down and they find this sealed door, and they begin to realize like maybe this is really a tomb that's never been opened before. And the story goes that they drilled a hole in the door, and Howard Carter sort of looking through it while they're all holding up their lanterns and such. And they say, well, what do you see? And he says, all manner of wonderful things. Which I just, again, whether that really happened or not, who knows? But it's a very poetic story of finding this, again, completely intact tomb. So one of the problems we run into as archaeologists and art historians is that when we try to talk about pharaohs and burials of the pharaohs, most of them are definitely looted. So we're kind of just going off of tidbits of information. This gave us a working knowledge of what a pharaoh would take into the afterlife. He would take various thrones. He would take various transportations, right? A chariot. He would take food. He would take art objects. So we get to see a little bit more and have more information on what we think most pharaohs had. And again, because he was a minor pharaoh, you can think about the fact that, what did a Khafre have? Someone who was considered a very high pharaoh, a very loved pharaoh. Like, what did Khafre have? Probably would have been like, double this or triple this, right? So it helped us sort of understand more about the grave goods, right? What we would find in these tombs. So Tut, we celebrate him more for his tomb than who he actually was as a pharaoh. And I love the strip on the left because it's actual photographs from the tomb when they opened it. So they're looking in, right, and they're seeing the objects as they are. On the right, you have the throne chair that it's one of the grave goods. And one of the things I always think is interesting is that Tut's art style, you'll notice, doesn't change immediately. This is a very Aten inspired art style that you see in some of his early pharaonic images. So, again, minds are hard to change. When something gets instituted, it's still hard to shake free of. They still see this sort of influence of the Aten, right, sort of kind of coming through. So again, Tut, we really think about him more so about his tomb than anything else. And I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about mummification when we got to Tut, because he has an intact mummy, and we could talk a bit more about the idea of mummification, right, through looking at Tut's mummy. So here you had Howard Carter and one of his assistants looking at the mummy. Now, mummification, how was it done? It was a process that every Egyptian, right, had to undergo in order to preserve the body for the afterlife. And again, because there was the Ka and the Ba, this idea of a soul and a spirit, they also felt very strongly that the body had to be preserved. So you had your body going as the mummy into the afterlife, but also your Ka and your Ba, your spirit going there as well. What they would do, if you look at the instruments on the left, is they would remove your bodily organs. They would keep like your heart, your liver, your lungs, etc., for mummification and placement into the canopic jars. The brain actually was thrown away. So we always sort of laugh about, they didn't think the brain was anything. They thought your heart was the seat of your soul. So that was the most important part of your body as far as they were concerned. They thought the heart, again, was the seat of your ka. So they'd remove your organs, as I say, all the juicy bits, they'd take that out. And then they would cover your body with a salt mixture called natron. So you'll notice they're pouring the salt over the body in the right hand image. And this is a process that would dry out or, jerkify. I always say it's like making a piece of beef jerky, right? Dry out the body, take the oils and the waters out of the body. That's why you had to take the organs out first. So your body would be dried. It would take somewhere between 60 to 90 days, depending on how juicy you were, I suppose. And then after that, your heart was inserted back into your body because your ka had to stay with your body. And then your body was anointed with oils and lotions and such. And then it was wrapped in linens. Different types of amulets for protection were placed either in the wrappings or on the wrappings. And you'll note the Book of the Dead between the hands. And we'll talk about that here in a second. As I mentioned, the other organs, the liver, the stomach, the lungs, and the large intestine, were placed in your canopic jars. Now, the information on the bottom, it's not something I expect you to memorize. I know that it's a lot and it's a lot of hard names. I'm just asked very often about who are the four sons of Horus, and then what do they preside over? Which organs did they preside over? So I try to give you as much information as possible, but I would never test you on this. It's a little too intense, I think. But you'll note that the canopic jars, each top is representative of one of the sons of Horus, as we call them. And in each jar would be the organ that related to that son of Horus. So again, you can look at each image and say, oh, Imseti, it's the human, right? That's on the left. That presided over the liver. That son of Horus presided over the liver. So your canopic jars, right, were where your organs are placed, and they'd be placed in the tomb with you. If you've ever seen the movie The Mummy, I always joke that those people could have avoided death if they just would have put down that canopic jar and ran. The mummy wanted his organs back. So each person was stealing one of his canopic jars, they had to die. And then he sucks their life force, right? I'm always like, just put the canopic jar down and run, right? You'd be okay, but no, it's a movie, right? But again, this is part of the mummification process. Now, your canopic jars could be very fancy if you were more elite, like Tut, right? Or more simple, like this, if you were an everyday person. Because as we talked about, each person would be mummified, each person would have a tomb, each person would have grave goods. Here's an example of one of the amulets. This was the popular Eye of Horus. Most of these amulets were protective in some kind of way, and they'd be placed in the wrappings, right, or on the wrappings. And of course, then your body would be placed inside a sarcophagus. I'm showing you Tut's because we've been talking about Tut, and I want to show you something high-end to contrast with the canopic jars I just showed you. So Tut's sarcophagus, of course, was gold, and of course he has the famous head mask, the face mask, and then also the sarcophagus itself, so double the gold, right, for Tut. So again, just imagine what someone like Khafre had, right? It's like you have to stop for a minute and go, wait a minute, would have been really pretty cool probably, right? Um, so again, we can think about the levels of richness, right, to these tombs. And what would be in a typical tomb? You would find, of course, your grave goods, your carvings, your paintings. You also would find the very important Book of the Dead that I had shown sort of between the hands of the mummy. The Book of the Dead I refer to as the cheat sheet for your afterlife. Every Egyptian knew what was going to happen in the afterlife because the Book of the Dead told them. They knew that there was an evaluation process, a judging that would happen. So, again, thinking about comparative religion, you can go forward to find Christianity in the medieval period and look at something like the weighing of the souls. And many people think the Jews carried this idea out of Egypt by seeing the books of the dead and so on and so forth. In the image, you'll notice the deceased on the left hand side is being brought in by Anubis, and he is then showing the person the scales of justice essentially. The heart of the person would be weighed against the feather of truth, which was related to the goddess Mat. So on the scale, you'll notice to the left is your heart in like a little jar, and to the right is a feather, which represented the goddess Mat, who was the goddess of truth. So the idea is that you should balance against truth or rise above it. If your soul sank, Amit, who's sitting there, gets to eat it and destroy it. Amit is a tribrid, I always joke, because he is three things in one. So he's not a hybrid, he's a tribrid. He has the head of a crocodile, the midsection of a lion, and the butt of a hippo, or the back quarters of a hippo. So hippo, lion, crocodile. And Amit would destroy the souls of the unworthy. And for Egyptians, this would be the ultimate terror to them, that they could not go into the afterlife and not celebrate the afterlife. So that would be like a double death to them, worse than the first death, that they didn't get to pass on. But of course, our deceased person is a good person, so he then moves to the audience with Osiris, who would then ask questions and decide to admit or decline admittance, right, to the afterlife. So that's how this process would work. People would use their Book of the Dead to inform them, right, of the rules, essentially. And again, in your typical tomb, you'd have tomb paintings, right? You'd have things showing people hunting and people dancing and having fun. I like showing you this one because you actually see the typical standard hierarchy of scale for families. So you'll notice there's a very large man who's the father, smaller mother, and then very small child. So this gives you a very realistic depiction of usually how hierarchy of scale was shown and why Akhenaten's was very different than the usual canon and how it was applied. And one of the last things I wanted to show you from inside a tomb were the Ushabti, or the little servant figures that most people had in their tombs. Again, you can tell status by looking at the Ushabti. If someone had a lot of Ushabti, we'd probably think, they were very, high up in the hierarchy. If you had a few, then you probably were lower down. So these would have been your servants in the afterlife, and they could go around and do things for you in your perfect afterlife.